other countries to build up the production of the sort of foods we produce. And that, to me, is where the big issue lies in the future.
Right, because that was well highlighted in the report, wasn't it, Neville, saying that New Zealand has sort of at most a 5-year advantage in terms of commodity product production.
That's right, and because intensification, how much more use you can get out of land is really a scientific research issue. You've also, one country we haven't mentioned is Brazil, where you've got vast amounts of farmland that have never been farmed. It's the largest supply of land in the world. So, I mean, that's obviously going to have a cost impact. But just how far we go down the intensification path, I don't know. There was a Dutch expert speaking here at last week's Food Summit, and he said 50 years ago the same amount of dairy production was produced on 10% of the land today. So it shows you a 90% improvement in 50 years in dairying in Holland on land use alone is pretty dramatic.
But there would certainly be some pushback amongst the New Zealand public if we looked at some of those farming systems that are utilised in the Netherlands, particularly in the dairy industry. Just look at the hue and cry over plans for freestall farming down in the Mackenzie Basin.
Well, that's true, but that said, rural areas of New Zealand are depopulated by anybody's standards, and I think more people would want to go and live in the country if there was better roads and infrastructure and that sort of thing, and we'd become a bit more like Europe, where more of the landmass was covered because the farming land was producing more but taking up less space.
Yeah, do you agree with that, Keith?
Yeah, and I think one of the other issues is the whole issue of irrigation, which is a critical factor to increasing production in New Zealand, and the storage of water, which we haven't done enough of in New Zealand, which would lead to greater production. But against that is the issue of water quality and so on. So we've got to be very careful in how we do it.
The government is indicating it's going to move shortly on the whole water issue side of things. Do you think that's going to be soon enough and go far enough for most farmers?
Well, governments are always rather cautious on things and aware of votes, but I would hope that we can get a much quicker RMA working so that decisions can be made on things like water storage and the way we use the water.
Well, we'll look forward to that. Now it's on to You Said It. Comment in the ag media that we think is worthy of further discussion. Keith, there was an article in the Herald on Sunday talking about a quality revolution that's overcoming US consumers when they're looking for agricultural products to buy. Your wife's originally from the US. What's your view on this?
Well, I think quality is very important and things like that, but from talking to all my relatives in America and my wife and our friends who visit us, the question of sustainability and the other issues are still important. I think quality has always been one of the things we've aimed at in New Zealand.
The report seemed to be suggesting that sort of pure and simple were the sorts of things that US consumers were now more concerned with. Well,
I think our farming methods are much more pure and simple than in the States, where they house their animals and all those sort of things.
Right. What do you think, Neville? You might see the sort of whole level of the increase in interest in farmers' markets sort of coming through when you're talking about these trends with consumers.
Well, I wouldn't blame Hollywood, but there's been some quite influential films about the factory side of farming, and they've had a huge impact in America on, at least in some consumer groups, especially those in the middle class and can afford to buy. I think farmers' markets took off around Hollywood because of the actors anyway, so there's no doubt that that's a bit of a class issue there, and it's certainly strong in certain areas, but I wouldn't say that factory farming is going to go out at any time soon.
No. So are we capitalising enough on the advantages that we do have, Keith, or could we be doing more to promote our sustainable agriculture?
I'm sure we could do more, but I think one of the things a lot of Americans find when they come to New Zealand, they like the food. That's what our guests did. And the quality of the food, and the more Americans that come, the better. So we can capitalise it both in America and here. But I still think price is a very important issue when you've got so many people in America losing their homes and being in severe debt situations.
Well, moving on to the Fonterra Step 3, share trading amongst farmers. It's had a generally positive reception, Neville. But
it's been given a good boost by the Craffer Farm fiasco, I think, because of the fear of overseas owners coming in and snapping up individual farms by whatever means and maybe changing them has obviously concentrated the minds of a lot of people in the rural community because they do have the money and and obviously Fonterra is protected from those great loss of capital. But I think this is only an interim measure. There's still got to be a lot of more outside capital coming into that industry.
A lot of dairy farmers would be very concerned about rushing to agree to a share trading proposal amongst themselves, just driven by the fear of Chinese ownership of some dairy properties, wouldn't they?
I think the fear would concentrate their minds quite a bit if they saw any degree of large-scale foreign ownership coming in. Not that I think that that's going to happen. I think this proposal from the Chinese one we've had so far is not really realistic.
No. What do you think, Keith?
Well,
you think farmers are right to
to
be concerned there?
I think farmers are always concerned about losing control to some degree. I noticed in the press this morning that the Fonterra head man was saying that they had a very good response from farmers all around the country, and they're talking about the share trading thing. So.
Yeah, so it seems as though they are moving in the right direction.
Correct.
And may be able to stave off any concerns that farmers have. Yeah. All right, well, moving on to the drought. The area has been extended by government. Is this an indication, Keith, that New Zealand agriculture perhaps just isn't resilient enough to take these sort of knocks?
Well, there's several points. One is my whole thing on irrigation is once again becoming critical, and the greater production we want from land, the more secure we've got ahead of the water resources. But I think the issue of drought is the number of farmers who have a debt situation where they have to be talking to their bankers and so on to cope with the situation, and there will be more farms come on the market.
What do you think, Neville?
Well, it's definitely these dry years seem to be increasing, and obviously scientific research, that kind of thing, making farms more productive, water storage, that kind of thing is obviously the way to go. And I think farmers realise that money has to go into that area, and it's good to see that, say, if ag research has got spare scientists lying around, this is the area where they should be working.
Exactly.
Right. So we actually want a situation where we're not lurching from sort of a 1 in 50 dry year to a 1 in 100 dry year type of situation. We actually want a strategy across the board.
And the trouble with 1 in 100 dry years is they tend to come every 3 or 4 years at some time. So
that can be a real difficulty.
And if we get more intensive rain when it does come, is another one, because you've got a problem with runoff and waste and that sort of thing. So I think there's mechanisms that can be done to capture more of that rain, not let it go to waste.
Right. Well, there does seem to be a silver lining, at least with the drought. Indications are our greenhouse gas emissions will be decreased. This is good news, or maybe not, Keith?
I think it's bad news, personally. I think it reflects a drop in income for New Zealand and the drop in income for individual farmers. And I think it's very bad economics to look at it that way.
Right. What do you think, Neville? There is the indications by the Greens that if both National and Labour had stuck to their plans and perhaps we'd been able to keep greenhouse gas emissions back at 1990 levels, there would have been a huge boost for the economy there.
Well,
that's just dreaming, isn't it?
The logical conclusion of eliminating greenhouse gas is that you eliminate all livestock and any kind of industrial activity. Exactly. And while it might sort of it does give a bit of a breathing space for the government to put that EFTS on hold. I think that's still essential, and we see rising inflation and one or two of these issues coming through, and I think the government the public opinion hasn't quite caught up with the dangers of inflation from having that trading scheme.
Right. So is there somewhat of a level of people not believing that the ETS is here to stay? It's something that's going to be altered or manipulated or got rid of at some stage?
It's really an intangible type of thing, and but when it starts hitting home with higher taxes and loss of income, I think people will get a bit more realistic about it.
Yeah, they'll really understand what's happening then. Yeah. Now, there's a story in the Farmers Weekly about Australian wine growers very upset that Argentinian wine in plastic 2-litre containers is selling for about $1. Are we going to see the same situation here, Keith?
I don't know, but I was speaking to a friend of mine who's got a vineyard in Marlborough just 2 nights ago, and he said that he had 50 tonnes of grapes that he wasn't able to sell under his